Alrighty. Well, let's give it a little bit and then we'll get going. All right, let's blast off. All right, well, thanks for coming, everybody. My name is Dr. Sherry Pagoto. I am a professor here at the University of Connecticut, and director of the Yukon Center for mHealth and Social Media. And I have a K-24, which is a mid-career award that covers some of my time to do mentorship, which is fun. And so through that, I've been spending the last many years helping mentees get training grants, whether it's a K award or an F. And so we thought we would share some of the wisdom that we've picked up over the years in terms of how to be successful with these grants. I have my doctoral student, Jared Goetz, with me, who has an F31, and I'll let him introduce himself right now, and then we'll dive into our presentation. And if you have questions as we're chatting, throw them into the chat. Some of you submitted ones in advance, and we tried to make sure that we were addressing them as in our slides. So hopefully we address a lot of your questions, but if not, yeah, fire them off in the chat at any point in time. I'll be keeping my eye on the chat. And we have plenty of time at the end too to address some questions. But anyways, without further ado, Jared, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, hi everybody. As Shay said, I'm Jared. I have an F31 fellowship, and I'm excited to share, the lessons I've learned while applying. I applied for this fellowship 3 times, before being successful ultimately. So I have a lot of experience with what went well and what needed to be addressed that hopefully I can help anyone who's interested in applying one maybe learn from, the bumps I had instead of having the bumps themselves. And yeah.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Jared, um, for sharing your experiences and you said you did 3 tries before you were successful, but each try was on the road to success. So I see that as all a success. Because we know how grants go. Sometimes you gotta fire off a few applications. Okay, so let's just dive in. We're going to start just with like some high level definitions in terms of like what is the F31. So NIH has different training grants. Some of them are institutional and some of them are individual. So you may have heard of T's, like T32s and things like that, that someone like me, like a PI, can write an institutional grant that would bring in regular funding for predoctoral students. But what we're talking about today are the Fs, which is the applications that your student, or if you are a student, can write yourself. So the award is directly to you as opposed to an award that goes to the university or a more senior person. So I just wanted to make that distinction. So basically the fellowships are training grants that support doctoral students for their dissertation, research, and training. Most request somewhere like 2 or 3 years, but I think you can request maybe even up to 5 years. So it kind of depends on when you're going to apply, in terms of like how many years you need to cover the rest of your doctoral training. The funding covers tuition and fees. You get a stipend. Those of you who are doctoral students right now might say, well, I already get a stipend. So what's nice about having the F31 is right now your stipend is probably for a GA or a TA. You don't have to worry about that anymore if you get the F, because it's basically covering your time to do your dissertation. So it's kind of nice to have that extra free time. Like, for example, Jared was on a GA before this, so he was able to relinquish his GA activities and really just focus on his dissertation. It was nicely timed, like his last 2 years of the graduate program, so he can just, stay focused on getting that dissertation done without having, these other responsibilities. that his assistantship was paying for. There's an institutional allowance. We'll dive a little bit deeper into that. So it's an amount of money that you can spend on your research supplies, subject payments, travel, as well as health insurance. But like I said, we'll dig a little bit more into budget stuff in a little bit. So why does NIH offer these types of awards? Well, NIH has a big commitment to investing in the next generation of scientists. So there's all kinds of training awards that they have as part of that mission. This table here kind of gives you a layout of NIH funding. So over the course of a career, so starting with you're a student and then all the way going into you're a senior scientist. So you can see at the top are those training awards. So they're like I mentioned, the very first one says it's an institutional training grant. And then the ones below it in red are the ones that we're talking about, which are the individual training grants, the F31s and the F30s. All right. And I should mention that there are also Fs for postdocs, and postdocs also sometimes just apply for Ks too. But we have a whole nother webinar about Ks, which you can check out on our website. Now, if you are from an underrepresented background in science, and NIH has a definition of what that means, you may be eligible for the F31 Diversity Fellowships. Here are two of them that I know of. One is for health-related research, and another one is for Alzheimer's and dementia-related research. So if those are the directions that you're going with your research and you are of an underrepresented background, I would check those out for sure. Okay, so one important thing to know when you're going to apply for a grant is like, when are the deadlines? And like any NIH grant, there's usually about 3 major deadlines a year. The ones for F are a little bit different from the ones for an R or other mechanisms. So you've got April, August, December. So as Jared mentioned, it took him 3 cycles to get funded. And so I think one of the first things you want to do is kind of think about your timeline in the graduate program, when you would like to graduate, and then work yourself backwards into like, what deadlines do I want to shoot for to submit this grant? Allowing yourself more than one cycle. It's not that often that a grant gets funded on the first try. I've had that happen very rarely. So I never assume it's going to happen because it usually doesn't. So plan for like at least 2 cycles, and that'll let you know like which deadline in which year I should be thinking about. Like, should it be this August? Should it be December? Is it too late? Like maybe if you're in year 4 of your graduate program, maybe it would be too late to be planning for one of these now. But yeah, it's up to you. But I think that's the best way to kind of dig into it is kind of thinking about your timeline and when and giving yourself enough time to throw that application in. And we'll talk a little bit about preparation and how much time it takes to prepare. And I know Jared's going to talk a little bit about his story on that, because it takes a fair amount of time to prepare. So in thinking about the deadline that you want to hit, actually, I'll ask you, Jared, to reflect on that. Thinking about your first submission, about how much time did you prepare for that? So like I forget if you were putting in for August, I forget what your first one was, but like how many months in advance of the deadline were you working on it, would you estimate?
Yeah, so for me, the first submission was a real learning process. I ended up spending like a little over half a year getting ready to submit. And I actually had originally planned to submit the previous deadline. But after getting feedback from my mentor team, I realized I wasn't there yet, and I didn't want to submit something that would not be, received positively. So that's like the 6 months was before that. So then I had like an additional, 3 or 4 months or so to continue refining before I was actually ready to submit it. So it got pretty close most of a year.
Hmm.
Now, granted, I am a slow worker. I know some people like fly through writing, are super great at making edits really quickly, and that's not me. Your mileage may vary in terms of how much time you actually need. Um, but that's how much I needed, and I definitely needed all that time. Um, and it was, as I said, since I missed my original deadline, it was more than I had expected and planned out. I did a lot of planning to figure out how much time I would need, and even so, I was still a little bit off in terms of a realistic amount of time to really get the grant application in a place where I felt comfortable sending it into NIH.
Yeah, and I will say the timeline that you're describing is totally normal, pretty average of what people will put into it. Your first grant does take a lot of time because obviously you're totally new to it. You don't even know like half the documents that you need to be filling out and writing up, and the training grant, you've got all kinds of letters and there's all these pieces to it. Um, so I know you referred to yourself as slow, Jared, but I think the timeline that you described is actually pretty normal. And it's good advice to, assume that it's going to take longer than you think because it's your first time. And so it's hard to know how much time is something going to take. So let's talk about eligibility because you don't want to get too far into this and find out, oh my gosh, I'm not even eligible. Every grant mechanism has a program announcement which describes the details, including eligibility. So, kind of a first thing first would be to find that program announcement and read it through the eligibility criteria. Um, and you want to make sure that you qualify, but that also your project qualifies. So, for example, in terms of project, they're not looking for clinical trials to be proposed in an F, which isn't surprising because it's hard to do a clinical trial with such a small amount of funding. But so that's something to think about. Another eligibility issue is Fs are only open to U.S. citizens, nationals, and permanent residents. So if that's you, you're not totally out of luck because there are actually foundations that have similar types of fellowships. For example, I have a student who's going to be applying for the American Heart Association Fellowship. The application looks very similar, a lot of the same pieces of the application. So, in thinking about your interest area, you might take a look at the foundations, American Cancer Society, trying to think of some other ones. American Diabetes Association, and taking a look at whether those foundations might have fellowships. So all is not lost if you don't qualify for the NIH ones. We will be focusing on NIH ones in this talk, but there's definitely a lot of a lot is going to be relevant if you're going for a foundation fellowship too. So the biggest question people ask before they dive into a grant endeavor is, how likely is it for me to get funded? What are the funding rates? And there's all kinds of like concern about NIH funding. Well, here is a great graph that Jared found on the NIH website that shows you the funding trends over the last many years to give you a sense of kind of where funding's been. It's been hovering, so it's not lower than ever. It's been hovering around the same. But take all this with a grain of salt because you might be like, oh man, 21% is not blowing me away in terms of a funding rate. Although it's not terrible. Like it's not the worst funding rate of a grant mechanism. But we wanted to show you this too, because this is broken down by institute. So it tells a very more nuanced story here, and because you can see the success rates vary widely across institute. So one of the things that Jared and I talked a lot about when we were figuring out like which one he was going to apply for, which institute he was going to target, was looking at this information. And his topic was sort of in between a couple of institutes. He could have gone to NHLBI, he could have gone to NIDDK. And so, we were inspecting the funding rates because that's information that might break the tie of which institute to go to. especially if you're seeing like a big difference in the funding rate. So definitely, incorporate this information in your decision and which institute to target. Because when you put in a grant, you have to label the institute at NIH it's going to go to, and you may not recognize all these like institute initials here, but NIH is organized by all these different institutes, and each institute kind of focuses on like a different sort of health condition. Like we have NCI, which is National Cancer Institute. We have NIMH, which is the National Institute of Mental Health. So depending what your area is, you want to figure out what institutes you could be applying for. And this gives you a sense of how much they're funding, how many applications they get, and kind of what your likelihood is. I love that there's some that are, up to 40, 50, almost 60%. That's encouraging that, there's some institutes that are funding a lot, a high percentage of the applications they're getting. So not that this is, a matter of chance or like rolling the dice. But obviously this is good information if you're trying to figure out, which institute is the best match. And we'll talk a little bit in a couple of minutes about the next step in figuring out which institute is a good match. And a lot of that has to do with actually talking to someone at that institute to kind of find out if what you're proposing is kind of consistent with their portfolio. So you have the program officer as your point person. We'll talk about that in a minute or two. So here we just have kind of a layout of the pieces of your proposal. Training grants, I always tell people like they're the worst grants to write because there's so many pieces. Like our grants don't have quite as many pieces. So in a training grant, you've got a candidate statement. So if you've ever written a personal statement, for example, to get into graduate school, it's sort of like that. You have your specific aims, your research plan, which is describing the research that you're proposing. There are documents where you describe your environment. So like what sort of resources is your environment offering you? A training plan where you detail the training that you'll be getting. You do need to include training in responsible conduct of research. You provide educational information. And is that transcripts, Jared, the educational stuff? Did you have to put in?
So no, the educational information more speaks to the program that you're in as a PhD student.
Gotcha.
And that is often provided by like the program director at your institution.
Okay. All right. Thanks for clarifying. I was like, what was that again? Then you need a letter from each one of your mentors, of your mentor team, because you're going to get together a mentor team for this. And then you'll need letters of recommendation from other people who could speak to your likelihood of being successful with research. So that's a lot of letters. Okay. So let's just do like a high level on the candidate statement. So candidate statement, to me, I really think of it as the story of your intellectual journey. You don't have to cover every single thing that you've done professionally, but you want to tell the story of what led you to the research that you're proposing and the career direction you want to go in your research. So they're looking for like to learn about you and like what your vision is and what your experience has been so far. And then also what are the gaps in your training that you really need to have filled in order to be successful with this vision of a, program of research you have for yourself. So you want to think about, like the next 10 years, where do I see myself? What studies do I see myself doing? What expertise am I trying to develop? Because this training grant is really kind of your first step towards, building that program of research that you'll go forward and be super successful and get lots of grants to fund. So that's something to really think about is have you established that for yourself? Do you have a sense of what's the broad question that excites you the most? Like what kind of scientist do you see yourself being? You're an expert in what? That's a really important thing to think about as you're embarking on one of these applications, because they're really going to want to see you lay out that vision for yourself, and they'll want, students to have like a pretty concrete vision of where they see themselves going. And because, early in your career, sometimes you flip flop around, and there's a lot of things that are interesting, and you're still sort of sampling stuff. But eventually you kind of home in on, a particular direction. And so this is your opportunity to lay that out. So, and when I'm reviewing these grants, it's one of the first things that I read, because I'm like, okay, who are we talking about here? Who's our candidate? Let's hear their story. So I think it's really important to get that candidate statement to be really rock solid and tight, and really kind of sell yourself as, yeah, you're like the next big thing when it comes to your area of research. So I think of this path as kind of like, someone's career. Think of your F as the first step towards, this path that's going in a certain direction. So that's what you want to like lay out in your candidate statement, is like, who am I? You're basically telling the story of, I want to be an expert in X. And in order to do that, I want to collect this data so that I can have data to support the next study, which would be whatever, and so on and so forth. That will help me, build this program of research, being an expert in, whatever it is that you want to be an expert in. So super important document, the candidate statement. As important, if I had to pick the two documents that are the most important, I'd say the specific aims is next. It's a one-page that lays out the aims of the study, as well as establishing the significance of the research question, how it's building off of the existing literature, and justifying kind of the study as like the next step in the literature, what gap it is your study going to fill. So you're really kind of telling that story, and then laying out, usually, there's like 3 aims on average, a specific aims page. And unlike a specific aims page, maybe for an R grant, usually at the end, you pull it all together and tell that like story of like within a sentence or two of how this all ties together in terms of your career goal is to be an independent researcher focused on X. You'll receive mentorship and training in these 3 areas, which are essential to developing that program of research. Just so that you're kind of reminding the reviewers of like the high level of like what this is all about. Okay, so now let's say you're that far. You've got your candidate statement, you've got your aims. Now I'm going to call time out and say, take that aims and find a statistics mentor, so that you can figure out the sample size that you need to do the work. And you might say, well, why are we diving into that already? Because you want to make sure that what you're proposing is in the scope of what you're going to have the money to do for this grant. So once you know your sample sizes, you can calculate the budget and see like, am I way over? Am I way under? Like, can I afford to do what I proposed? Because if you're over budget, then you probably need to tweak your aims. So what you don't want to do is write the entire grant and then calculate the budget and discover, oh my gosh, I'm $50,000 over what I can do. I have to completely change my aims and rewrite the whole grant. So good to do that budget first so that you can pare down before you write the whole research plan. So yeah, don't procrastinate on that step. And it's also a great way to like engage that stat mentor. I think 99.9% of Fs should have a stat mentor, unless you're not doing, like maybe if you're a basic scientist, you may not need one, but if you're a clinical scientist, you probably do. So really, really important step to not delay on, so that you don't have to, revamp the whole grant, which would be awful. So while we're at talking about budgets, let's dip a little bit more into that. How do you calculate a budget? You might be like, what? I don't know how to do a grant budget. So I'd find out who in your institution can help with that. There's probably somebody who does that for investigators. And so if you can find out who that is, they can help walk you through how to cost it out. So like we were saying earlier, there's kind of 4 areas of budgeting to think about. You've got the stipend that they give you, there's tuition and fees, the institutional allowance, which covers the cost of the research, your health insurance, travel to scientific meetings, that kind of thing. Now, most grants also have indirect costs. And what an indirect cost is an amount of money that actually goes to your institution to pay the institution for, keeping the lights on and providing resources to you. Fs don't have indirect costs. And so another thing I would ask your budget people is, are they going to take any cost out of your institutional allowance? That would be important to know, because if it turns out they are, then that's going to shrink how much money you have to do your research. So these are kind of like logistical details I would sort out. And I would push against your institution taking indirect costs. And so, yeah, like you could work with your department chair or something to see like if there's a way to push against that, if they do say that they want to take some, because your institutional allowance is so small, like that's just going to chew it all up. So just if they say yes, they're going to take a cut, like it doesn't necessarily mean you can't negotiate. Most things are negotiable. So let's talk nuts and bolts money. And yeah, Jared, like feel free to jump in at any time if I miss something. So NIH posts what the stipends are for your level of training. So if you have, so as a predoctoral, I guess regardless of years of experience, it's the same stipend. For postdoctoral, years of experience like bumps up the stipend. I don't know why it doesn't for predoc, but so this is the stipend for fiscal year 2023. Is that more or less than the stipend you're already getting? If it's a pay cut, that may be something you want to think about. Like, do I want to take a pay cut for this? Something to talk about with your mentor. Okay, now let's dip into the other things. So, okay, so you've got the tuition and fees that they're going to cover. So here's kind of the fine print related to that. And for the individual fellows, the institutional allowance, and this is kind of anticlimactic, is really only $4,550. So you get that amount each year of the grant. Now, that money kind of dwindles really fast because if you have health insurance, you need health insurance, it's going to be coming from that amount. Your research supplies, subject payments, et cetera, travel, conference registration, books. So any training that costs money, so maybe you were going to like pay for $1,000 training institute in the summer to learn some sort of statistical modeling, that's coming out of the 4,500. So that money's going to disappear pretty quickly. Jared, like any comment about this from you?
Yeah, so I mean, you covered the important part, which is that it's actually not very much money. There's no separate money that can be used specifically for the research, unlike in a lot of grants where when you're creating the budget, you're creating a budget for the actual study you want to do. If you're trying to think through projects that you could actually do on an F31, it needs to be something you can afford, basically with the very limited amount of money you have. And Sherry mentioned this on the previous slide, but making sure that you actually have all that money before you start planning how to budget it is really important. So I do know that some people who have applied for F31s and succeeded in getting them didn't realize, for example, that health insurance would come out of it. It does say it in the program announcement, but I think people sometimes think of this as like the money for the grant, basically. And so that can be a surprise if it's like $1,500 for health insurance, and so you end up with, like a third of what you were planning as your budget missing. Um, and that's a big deal. Um, it limits
Yeah.
what you can do a lot, and it makes you have to think very carefully about how you want to use this money, whether it's for training or conferences or things like that, because it's definitely not an unlimited bucket.
Yeah. And Jared is married, and so his wife has health insurance, and so he was fortunate to where like he didn't have to put his health insurance costs on here. But if you do, it's important to figure out what that's going to cost, and then what that does that leave you each year to pay your participants or whatever other costs your research and training has. So yeah. So okay, so once you have your aims finalized, and another step to do is go ahead and contact the program officer, who is the official at NIH who interfaces with grant writers to guide and support them. So that's what they're hired to do. You're not bothering them. And a lot of times people will tell me like, "Oh, well, I don't want to bother them." Like, this is their job. Like, they're just sitting there waiting for you. And it's important to develop a relationship with that person, because they do become very instrumental, like as the process goes on, in guiding you. Um, and so I have my students email that program officer and say, "Hi, I'm planning on submitting an F for the August deadline, and I'd love to run my aims past you and chat, for a little bit. I have some questions." And so they will schedule a meeting with you. And here are some questions you could ask. One thing that I think is important to ask is like whether the aims are within the scope of research they're funding for this mechanism, just to kind of make sure that there's a match there. I also try to listen like for, does the PO seem kind of excited what I'm doing, or did they seem like they don't know what I'm talking about? Especially if you're in between institutes, you can get a feel for like, where was the enthusiasm?
Yeah.
Yep, go
So
ahead.
sorry, yeah. So that's where I found myself is, as Sherry mentioned earlier when we were talking about, the different funding rates at different institutes rather. I was interested in potentially using NHLBI or NIDDK, because both do work with obesity, which is where my research is. Um, and feeling out the program officers and getting the response from them actually is what drove my decision to apply for the institute I applied for. So I ended up actually shooting for NIDDK, which, if we were to look back at the previous slide, basically has about like half the funding rate of NHLBI. And that was solely based on my interaction with the program officers at each, and getting more of a feel that at NIDDK, they were interested in the idea. Not that the program officer was super exciting or like, oh yeah, this will definitely go great or anything like that, but it definitely felt like um, they had a reaction where like they're like, yeah, that could work for us, potentially, and just a less neutral response than I got when I spoke to folks at NHLBI. And so that this was really important for me in trying to pick which one I went with, and I guess it's very clear since I went with the one that was like twice as hard, twice as unlikely to get, that it made a really big impact on what I thought was most likely to be successful in the end.
Yeah, and so yeah, those are the decisions you really want to make early on. And one question I always ask program officers, even to this day, is what are the common issues that arise in study section? Study section is the review panel that's going to review your grant. So what are the common issues that arise? Like, what do you hear all the time? Because they sit in those review meetings, and so they can tell you, okay, here's what people screw up on all the time. Like, I want to know that so that I'm not making the same screw ups, and I can like head off at the pass anything that's coming up. And they'll usually tell you lots of good things when you ask that question. So, all right, the next document is your institutional environment. There's probably versions of this at your institution from any investigator who has written similar grants. So you can, look at copies of it of people in your department. Like, what do you guys use for your institutional environment description? Because you're going to be describing the facilities and resources that your institution has. So for example, if there was like certain sort of machinery that you needed, that your institution has, you just want to make sure like it's all in there. Okay, let's move to training plan. So your training plan should have maybe like on average, like 3, maybe 4 areas of expertise that you need more training in. And each of those areas you're going to have a mentor for. So we talked about the biostats one. So the biostats person would be mentoring you on whatever sort of biostatistics is needed for you to do the project you're proposing. But there are other areas too that you need training in. So you sort of match mentor to training activity. And so each mentor is like overseeing a certain training activity. Each training area that you identify should have specific training activities that you will be doing to get trained in that thing. And you want to be sure in your training plan, you make the case that like this training would go beyond what you're already going to get in your PhD program. So it's not just a repeat. You need the grant in order to get this specialty training. So yeah, there is a biostatistician in my department, but it's not that that person is going to, be spending all this time individually on me in my PhD program. But with the F, we, lay out some specific ways that will work together so I can learn longitudinal analysis or whatever it is that you're proposing. Okay, so Jared has a nice little graphic here of kind of an example of how you might think about your training plan. So we've got a candidate here who's a nutrition PhD student who wants to propose a technology-based study on diabetes patients. And Jared, I'll let you kind of take it away.
Yeah, so then breaking it down, you can look at sort of the different elements of this proposed study and the proposed training they want to get based on training area. And when you're sort of creating the training plan, if you can find an example of previous training plans, it can be really helpful. But one thing you definitely want to do is make it very, very clear, how each thing you're doing fits into each training goal, each sort of training aim you have. So with here, we have it very clearly broken down in a table with longitudinal analyses coming from the biostatistician. They're going to have formal activities, including a class, and then doing a summer training institute. With health technology, with, again, a different mentor, one who's specialized in computer science. There's online Coursera class.
Are we losing Jared or are we losing me? I can't tell. But I have Jared freezing. Can you guys hear? Okay. I was like, I don't know if it's me or him. I'll pick up where he left off then. Okay. All right. So training areas are very specific, and you can see the mentors, their expertise maps onto each one of them. So we've got an endocrinologist, a computer scientist, and a statistician. Important that you don't have overlapping mentors in terms of their areas of expertise. So we don't need 2 biostatisticians or 2 endocrinologists unless they were very different and providing you something very different. But I would just kind of avoid like overlapping expertise. That is something that comes up a lot in training grants. And Jared texted me, his internet went out. So I'm sure he'll pop in if it comes back. And important to make sure that your training activities are structured and formal. So I would avoid things like, oh, we're going to do some readings or we're going to have meetings to just talk about stuff. Because reviewers know like that's not going to really happen. Like I'm not going to read all of that and we're not going to just like plan meetings to talk. So I would make sure that they're more structured than that. Like we're going to work on a paper, a review paper together, or I'm going to take this course or do the summer institute training, things like that that are more substantive than, just something that doesn't really have much structure to it. So in terms of a mentor team, like I said, the number of mentors maps out to the number of areas that you need expertise and training in. Your main mentor is usually going to be your graduate advisor. So that's easy. And so they're providing you whatever expertise that they have, which needs to map onto your topic. Like you don't want that disconnect. And so you want to think about, like what project can I like spin off of what my graduate advisor is doing? So that it makes sense that, that person is the main mentor. And then the other mentors can be people in your department, but they don't have to be. They could be anywhere in the university. It might even be someone with at a different university, but has a certain specialty area that you really need. And there isn't anyone like that within your university. In terms of a mentor experience, ideally, your primary mentor should have a track record of training grants. It may not be the end of the world if they don't, but however, it may be held against you a little bit. So I would make sure that you've got someone on your mentor team who does have a track record of having mentees get training grants, because then it will come up under the reviews of your mentors, unfortunately. And I'm sure like there's, plenty of people who don't have that track record who would be wonderful mentors. But it is a criteria that often comes up in review. So I just want to make it sure, at least ideally your primary mentor, but if not, then I would really call attention to how at least one of the mentors is senior enough to have like that track record. So here's just some thoughts on how to pick a mentor team. Obviously, the person who has the right expertise. It's nice if your mentors have some knowledge of the NIH Institute you're applying towards, and you can work with them to come up with training opportunities. So once you've reached out to a potential mentor, I would talk about with them, say, what I'd really love to learn, for example, is longitudinal analyses. And so I'm wondering if you could tell me what some training opportunities might be for me to work on that. And they might say, oh, well, I teach a class on that. And then also there's this Coursera that you should take because it has additional training that my course doesn't do. And so you'll have that conversation with them to figure out what should the training look like.
So there's a question in chat, Sherry.
Sure. Okay.
Again, sorry, everyone. I mentioned
Sherry's
chat.
back. Yeah.
My router died. Very lucky timing. Sorry, guys. So in chat, Abby asked if mentors should actually be in different fields and departments or just different research expertise. And I think that's a great question. It depends, in part on the training that you want to get. For me, however, like everyone is in the same department. I even have 2 clinical psychologists as my mentors, which is pretty close overlap. But they have different specialties, and so they have different research expertise that complemented my training plan and what I'm trying to learn. So the fact that they're in the same department or even have the same training background themselves isn't necessarily a problem if they have different research expertise or they can train you in what you want to learn.
Right. So like in Jared's case, so I'm a psychologist, he has another psychologist, but the other psychologist is an expert in ecological momentary assessment, and I do not have that expertise. So in describing her, he was talking up like that expertise because that's like a very specific expertise that like not every psychologist has. I also saw a comment coming through about if we could elaborate on how the training here needs to be different than what your graduate program would already provide. So what I mean by that is you want to include courses and activities that you would not do if it didn't get funded. So you don't want to just like put in the rest of the courses that you're doing in your graduate program, because then you don't need the F to get that training. You're already getting it. So the F is giving you training you would not already have. And that's why you need.
Oh,
Yeah.
sorry, Sherry. I thought you were
Good.
done.
Okay.
I would just add that a really important part in the application is not just that you are having this sort of non-PhD program training, but that you're making it very explicit to the folks reading your application that, these courses are not things you would normally be able to do. That the fellowship will give you, for example, the time you need to take extra courses to have this additional growth that's going to help you, down your career path. And so one thing I learned going through this is that things that even if you have all the information there, it's really important to make it explicit so that people can follow the story of why this grant is going to make the difference for you and get the effects that you're going for.
Yeah. So, like, for example, I would come right out and say, the training plan that I laid out, these are unique experiences that I would not normally be getting in my PhD program. I would need extra support in order to, take the class across campus in longitudinal analysis or do the summer institute that's going to teach me, this statistical model or, those kinds of things. Um, or to, spend 12 weeks on a Coursera for a particular topic. Like that wouldn't normally be in your PhD program. I mean, you could do it on the side if you wanted, but like the F pays you to, like, you're getting money to do that. Because remember, they're paying your stipend, not to just free, like as a free ride, like it's to actually pay for those training experiences. So instead of what you'd be doing for your GA or your TA, now you're taking these extra classes, learning, learning these different things to make you this like amazing rock star researcher that you're going to be. So that's kind of what we mean by that. Just for the sake of time, I'm going to scoot ahead. I'll say one more thing about mentors, though. You want to make sure that you're picking people who will actually have the time to go through your application, many drafts of it, and really work with you on it. Because you need that feedback. It's your first grant. And so you really want them to make sure that they have time to like really dig into it with you, iterate on drafts. I remember telling Jared in the beginning, I'm like, we're probably going to do like 200 drafts of your specific aims. So like apologies in advance. You're going to be like going crazy by the end of it, but we want to iterate and polish and polish and polish. And we're going to go back and forth until we're like, got it. Looks so good. It's ready to go. So yeah, you really want mentors who are going to like have the availability and willingness to like really work with you on that. Not just like a mentor in name, but a mentor in elbow grease, I guess is, I don't know, the alternative to that. Okay, so other tips, plenty of time to get feedback from those mentors like I talked about, or really anybody. You could even send it to your classmates if you have senior classmates who have Fs. Like my first grants, I would just ask anyone who was willing to read it and give me feedback. Obviously you want to be respectful in how you approach them. I wouldn't want to like email them, 24 hours before the deadline and be like, hey, do you mind reading my grant? Giving people plenty of time, asking them what would be a good time for me to send it for you to read, so that you're going to get the best reaction from them as possible. Like if they have time to really dig into it, you're going to get better feedback from them. So other tips, let's see. Okay, so the realisticness of what you're proposing, you want to make sure that it's doable. If you actually get funded, I think sometimes people will put a whole bunch of stuff in there, and it's almost like too much training. So you want to be careful about that it's not way too much time or not enough. So it could be too light or it could be too little. Another thing is when you're writing your grant, like the research section, the background section, don't assume that the reviewer has your expertise. So I would avoid jargon. I remember when my K got reviewed, my first K, my career development, I did the thing you're not supposed to do, like 2 days before it was due. I found the roster for the study section and it was all mostly MDs, and I'm a psychologist. And I was like, oh no, like, are they going to know what I'm talking about when I'm talking about different psychological things? But I hadn't thought like, who's my audience? I don't know. I don't know who I was writing it for, myself. I don't know. So you don't want to assume that your reviewers are experts. They may not be. So you just want to make sure that you're writing for a broad science audience. And because if you are like super jargony and that kind of thing, they may not know what you're talking about. And Jared, keep an eye on the chat in case there are other questions, and feel free to just like throw them at me.
So we have one that just popped up now, actually.
Yeah, let's hear it.
So this question is, if you submit for one cycle, what's the soonest you'll be able, oops, I just lost it. You'll be able to resubmit. What's the timeline for getting feedback and revising for a resubmission? And so I, as someone who has resubmitted a few times, basically you'll be able to get feedback from the committee that looks over your proposal in time to have like a month and a half before the next submission deadline.
Just not a lot of time, yeah.
It's not a lot of time at all, and you won't know if you're funded. So if you have a good score where you could be funded or not, you won't necessarily get that until after the submission time. So I think like it was like a month after when the actual success or not was supposed to come out for each of mine. However, given the feedback we got, I decided to resubmit immediately because I was able to knuckle down and focus just on fixing everything that all the really helpful feedback from the reviewers gave us. But you won't know for sure.
Yeah, like that's the thing is if you have light reviews and it's easily fixable, you could probably hit the next cycle. But if not, you might have to wait till the next one. So like, let's say you only have a month to get it in for December, you could be like, you know what, let's just wait till April, put the time into it and that kind of thing. And there was another couple of questions there, Jared. Do you see them?
Is that permissible to find out who's on the study section?
Oh, yeah, that was the one I wanted to address. Yeah, the Center for Scientific Review, they have a website. So this is like the center at NIH that is for scientific review. Go figure, the name. But anyways, what it is, it'll show you all the different study sections. And I don't know why we call them study sections, but because they're like the review panels. So you can figure out which review panel it is. You can even ask your PO, like which review panel will this go to, which study section. And it will show the roster of the last cycle. Now, you may not get the exact roster of people because sometimes they are cycling off. There might be guests who are on there, but it gives you like a general idea of who to expect. I mean, most of them probably will be there for the next cycle if it is a standing study section. And I think for the Fs, they usually are. There are some study sections that are called special emphasis panels, and they're just like a one and done, or, they're not always, it's not permanent, but there are permanent study sections, which we call standing study sections. And so most of the membership will probably be pretty similar from cycle to cycle, with the exception of the people who, I think they do like a 3 or 5 year stint and then they're done. So that was a really good question. Other questions, Jared, that you want to throw at me?
So we have another question is, how can mentors best support the growth of their mentees without micromanaging them?
Oh, yeah. Well, we could do a whole webinar on that. So I'm not a big fan of micromanagement because it's a lot of work. And so I do think like having mentee, yeah, that's more work than I have time for. Come up with a timeline. So I'll usually say, okay, you want to do an F? Awesome. Let's put a detailed timeline together of like all the different milestones to get us there. So you want to do December? It's February now, like map me out your milestones. And so then they send that to me and I'll like embellish it because they may not know different steps or how long they take. So I'll be like, okay, I'm going to bump this back. So we come up with a timeline that you can always sort of go back to, like, where are we at with the timeline? So like now let's fast forward, it's August. Then I'd be like, Jared, show me your timeline. Where are we? Are we behind? Are we ahead? Like, are we about where we should be? And that way if we're way behind, then we have the timeline to be like, oof, it's August, you wanted to shoot for December, and we're nowhere near that on your timeline. We might have to talk about maybe bumping to April or something like that. So timeline, I think, is really important. Other questions?
So here's another one. Is there a limit on number of resubmissions? And if you have reviews that aren't favorable, can you submit a different idea in the future? So I can answer the first part of that anyway, which is that you can do a single resubmission for any F. That does not mean, however, that you can't then do what I did, which was submit like a new submission with the same idea, just edited. So my third submission had to be submitted as a new submission, not as a resubmission. And I found ways to incorporate the critiques I'd gotten and also even acknowledge my previous application within the body of the grant proposal. But you can only do one official resubmission.
Yeah. But you can put it back in even if that tanks. So I'd say never give up. Obviously, if you run out of time and to keep going, you may need to stop, but like you might as well keep going. So some common critiques that I have seen in training grants, I've listed on these slides: big gaps in the literature review. That just reveals like maybe you didn't do your homework. And so the reviewers might start to wonder like if your study really is the next good step in the literature, if it's actually addressing a gap. Errors and oversights that tip the reviewers off that your mentors may not have been paying close attention. Mistakes that like a mentor with that experience would never make, which is a dead tip off that like the mentor didn't read it or that you disregarded the mentor's advice. It's hard to know which. So that's something to watch out for. Like make sure your mentor's eyeballs, like for example, I keep using stats as an example. I'm not sure why, but if the statistical plan, like if a statistician is your reviewer and reading it, they may be able to see things in it that might show them like, they'll be able to know, like, did a statistician read this thing? Like based on like how you're using terms and how thorough it is, like they'll know if someone didn't. They'll be like, I don't think the stat person is engaged, or maybe the candidate is just like disregarding what they say, but I can tell that just like the mentor is not, we don't have like enough engagement. My next slides are more like common critiques, but I want to make sure we get to our questions because you guys can have access to the slides, but maybe not as freely to us. So Jared, are there any other questions we should try to squeeze in? I know we got about
so again, about resubmissions. So if we get feedback and then you find out that you resubmit, but then you actually, the first submission gets funded, what happens?
If you're resubmit.
So if you resubmit, but then it turns out, a month later, you find out that your initial submission is funded.
Oh, you can revoke the resubmission and then throw a party for yourself because you got funded. So yeah, if that happens, you can always withdraw your resubmission if it did turn out you got funded. This is where it's good to be very close with your program officer so you can kind of navigate that and be like, should I resubmit? Like, is there a chance? Because after your grant gets reviewed, it goes to something called scientific council, where I don't know who's in that meeting, but program officers are, and other people who get paid a lot of money at NIH and make big decisions. And that's where they kind of decide who, like, what's going to get funded. So if you're really close to the funding line, this is where it's nice for the PO to know you and like you, because they can champion for you. They'll be like, Jared is amazing. He's been working so hard on this. This is like his third time putting it in. He's been so responsive, so that's why it's good. They're the only person you may have on the inside who can like wave the flag for you and like cheer you on. So that's something to keep in mind is to stay in touch with that person, not just before you put it in, but after you get that score. It's a second phone call that I make to them and to say, like, here's the score, here are the reviews. let's talk about like what I should do next and hear what their advice is on that. And they're often in the review. So you can also ask them like, what was the sentiment? Like, what was the feeling? Which of these critiques like was the thing that was getting kind of the most airtime in the discussion? They can't tell you exactly what was said in the discussion, but they can, say, the thing about blah, 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 like that, it was the thing they spend the most time on. So like, make sure that you really nail that one, because that's what was like the sticking point. Okay, so I see that we're at 1 o'clock. And so, like I said, the rest of these slides are about common critiques that come up. Some of these things we've mentioned. One training plan related one is if you have training for a skill in there that you're not actually going to need to do the research that you proposed. So you don't want to just throw something in for the fun of it because you've always wanted to learn it. Because they'll be like, why do you need to be trained in that in order to do the study you just proposed? It's not in that study. So that, like, you want to be really careful about that. And here's a bunch more the things that can come up. Make sure that you prove that you can recruit the population you need. Make sure that you have the statistical power to ask the questions that you're asking. You're using validated measures. Critiques on your mentors might be you have overlapping mentors too with the same expertise. Or mentor may not have exactly the expertise that matches what you need. So they're like, why are you working with that person? You're kind of going in a different direction. If the mentors seem very busy based on roles that they have, like I remember someone had picked a mentor who was also like a provost, and it came up in study section. They were like, is that like that person's got like, you're a provost, you've got like a lot on your plate. Are you really going to be able to be mentoring this graduate student in the same way that like a regular faculty person is, who isn't like, keeping the lights on at your university and everything else fancy that the provosts do? I don't think they keep the lights on, but they make big decisions and have tons of meetings and may not have that kind of time. Okay. Oh, and also if your primary mentor doesn't have any NIH funding, that could be a liability, because they also kind of want to know that your mentor could pony up some money if you needed it. And so if there's no research funding, your mentor doesn't have any research funding, I bet that will come up. So something to think about. All right, I know we're a couple of minutes over, but all of this whole recording will be posted on our website. Happy to share the slides. If anyone wants them, feel free to reach out to either of us. We can send them to you. And if there are questions that you want to ask that we didn't get to, feel free to email them along to me. I'm going to unshare and see if there's anything, any last minute questions that we should try to get to. Let's see.
So there was one question about what a score means in terms of like the NIH review.
Yeah, so that's a big question. So when you do have that meeting with your program officer, I would ask them to send you, and you can actually find this on the NIH website too, the document that the reviewer fills out when they review your grant. So, and actually I have a study section tomorrow, not for Fs, but for something else. And they give us this document with all the different areas that we need to rate the grant on. So like you're going to get a score on your training plan, your mentors, your candidate, your research, your environment. Each of those things is going to get a score. So as a reviewer, I need to score all those things and then mention the strengths and weaknesses that I saw. So it's important to know like what areas they're scoring and then what criteria they're scoring it on. And that's like another question to put on your list for the program officer. What are they looking for in the candidate statement? What are they looking for in the training plan and that kind of thing? Like how do they rate a good one versus a not so good one? And some of the tips we have in our slides get at that too. So yeah, I can do like one more last minute question if there is one. Let's see. Oh, if my mentor has NIH funding but is early career, will they take that into account when looking at lack of training grants? I think as long as they have NIH funding, that's good. And I would, just to cover my bases, make sure that one mentor on the team has some experience with training grants, because you can always say, while Dr. So-and-so, Dr. Early Career has NIH funding, they have not actually mentored a training grant yet. However, Dr. More Senior Person has mentored 7 training grants. And then they're going to be like, okay, it's fine. Like, you've got a senior person there, you've got your young, early career hot shot. Perfect. Like, as a reviewer, I'd be like, yeah, that's fine with me. Just to, you want to make sure someone in the mix knows how to usher a student successfully through a training grant, because the work doesn't end when you get funded. Now we got to like make sure, the student brings the project to the finish line. And so they want to make sure that, is there someone there who like has had some experience doing that? Doesn't mean you won't get funded if nobody does. It's just, it could come up in review. And it just depends on how much that reviewer feels that's an issue. But if they haven't gotten, one way you could work around this is, if your mentors haven't mentored a formal training grant, you could talk about how much they've mentored students through dissertations. So like, if there's a mentor who's mentored 50 dissertations, that's a lot. Even if it was like 25 or whatever, they've done tons. That would settle my mind that, like, yeah, this mentor knows how to usher people through a dissertation. So like some sort of data around their track record of mentoring is important, I think. All right. Well, I know we were a little bit over, but I feel like we could talk forever about this. It's an exciting topic. I hope you guys have a ton of luck with your training grants. And like I said, reach out to myself or Jared. I know Jared is open to sharing his application if you want to see what a successful one looks like. Ask at your university if you can get copies of successful applications that have been funded. Always nice to have a template, so you can get a visual of like how each of these sections look.
Yeah, I definitely, if you can, look at multiple funded ones, because people do things slightly differently, but it's so incredibly helpful.
Definitely. All right. Well, good luck. Happy grant writing. And yeah, feel free to reach out if you have questions going forward.